Maggie and Christopher knew each other since high school, when they sat together and quietly helped each other answer questions asked by the teacher. Starting from the 8th grade, their classmates saw them as a couple, although they didn't really think of their relationship that way. Maggie and Christopher were good friends, and they didn't see their friendship as anything more. The only student who was openly against their relationship was Luke Thompson. For some inexplicable reason, Luke disliked Christopher at first sight, seeing him as a rival who could prevent him from establishing control over their entire class. Even though Maggie didn't want to get involved, she ended up in the middle of their rivalry. Bullying the teenage girl from a poor family, Luke had only one goal in mind: to humiliate her in front of all of the other students. Thus, the teenager intended to kill two birds with one stone, to assert himself in the class and get to Christopher, who had become his #1 enemy by that time. "You dirty beggar, who are your parents, some broke farmers?" Luke asked defiantly. When he reminded Maggie of her dysfunctional family, tears welled up in the poor girl's eyes. She knew that there was some truth to Luke's words, which was why they always hurt her deeply. Maggie's mother worked as a waitress, and her father had a disability ever since he was in a car accident. Therefore, when Luke commented on his classmates' poverty, he knew full well that he was hitting her weak spot. Meanwhile, Maggie's life was so bleak that it seemed that nothing would ever change. At moments like these, Christopher's help was simply invaluable, as it gave the girl at least some sense of protection. Over time, Maggie got used to Luke's obnoxious comments and stopped paying attention to them. But one day, Luke's desire to humiliate his classmate made him cross the line. That day, Luke deliberately smeared the girl's chair with something sticky, which was why her school uniform ended up being hopelessly ruined. "What am I going to tell my mom now?" Maggie kept saying, smearing tears all over her face. "Now you know your true place, you dirty beggar," Luke said, suppressing a malicious laugh. At that moment, Christopher came into the classroom. He didn't yet know what had happened to his friend. But when he saw Maggie's ruined uniform, his mind went dizzy and his cheeks flushed with anger. Christopher could barely remember what happened next. Having grabbed the collar of Luke's shirt, the teenager pulled it with such force that it started tearing. The rest of the classmates watched them fight, commenting loudly on their every move. Some of the students were smart enough to get the teacher, who came in and managed to pull apart the teenagers rolling on the floor. Half an hour later, Luke and Christopher were at the principal's office, waiting for an in-depth conversation about their rivalry. Both of them got beat up pretty well that day, so their classmates couldn't even determine who was the winner of the fight. Before that day, Christopher and Luke openly disliked each other, but afterwards, they turned into true enemies. But Maggie was finally left in peace, which she'd long hoped for. There was only 1 year left before graduation. By that time, Christopher and Maggie had officially started dating and even told their parents that they were now a couple. When the prom music died down, the young people both applied to the best colleges in the state. However, when it was time to pick a major, Christopher and Maggie turned out to have very different preferences. While Christopher decided to go into IT, Maggie was so much more interested in studying economics. Fortunately, taking different classes didn't get in the way of the couple's relationship. They continued to spend their free time together, just as they did before. Imagine the young couple's surprise when during their junior year, Luke Thompson, the very person who made Maggie's school years a living hell, transferred to their university. Seeing his nemesis on campus made Christopher tense up visibly, but Luke simply walked by as if he didn't even know who Christopher was. As it turned out, Luke, like Maggie, decided to major in economics, and thus he took the same classes as she did. "If he starts bothering you, you let me know right away. I'll deal with that bastard," Christopher said. "No, don't worry about it, it's okay. I feel like he doesn't even notice me," Maggie hastened to reassure her boyfriend. Christopher smiled and pulled Maggie in for a gentle kiss in response. Enjoying their time together, the young people didn't know that, in fact, Luke Thompson didn't forget anything and was working on a revenge plan all this time. The devious young man was probably just waiting for the perfect time to get back at Maggie and Christopher. making sure to hurt them in the very heart. Three years flew by. Nothing really changed in the life of the young couple during this time. After graduating from the university, Christopher and Maggie got married. Even though the wedding ceremony was rather modest, it still left only the warmest memories in the hearts of their guests. Christopher directed all of his energy to a career in IT, just as he planned, while Maggie got a job as an economist at one of the firms in the city. It seemed that the young family would finally have prosperity and family happiness in their life. A year later, Maggie found out that she was pregnant. Needless to say, Christopher's eyes shone with happiness at the mere thought that he would become a father. Despite the fears expressed by Maggie's doctors, she felt good throughout the entire pregnancy. She never had morning sickness or even felt dizzy. Moreover, the woman continued to work until the very last day of her pregnancy, so she started having contractions right in the office. When Maggie gave birth to a beautiful baby, Christopher's joy knew no bounds. Rocking his tiny daughter, Mia, in his arms, the young father couldn't stop thanking fate for bringing him and Maggie together. Now that a beautiful, fair-haired miracle had appeared in their family, the young parents directed all of their efforts to raising her. 3 years flew by, filling the life of Christopher and Maggie with countless pleasant and unforgettable moments. Since both parents spent most of their time at work, they turned to a recruitment agency to find a nanny for baby Mia. Now, Maggie could stay late at the office without fearing that her daughter wouldn't get the attention she deserved. Christopher respected his wife's desire to build a career and thus never showed any disapproval of her irregular working hours. Therefore, when one April day Maggie had to stay late at work again, her husband took it rather calmly. Christopher trusted his wife completely, and therefore he never had any fits of jealousy or started fights over her staying late at work. However, when it was already very late and Maggie still hadn't come home, Christopher tried to call her and find out what was wrong. Unfortunately, her phone went straight to voicemail, which meant that either her battery died or she was somewhere where there was no coverage. At that point, Christopher got worried. As it turned out, Maggie was supposed to have a business meeting to discuss an important deal that day, but she never made it. When Christopher and the police tried to retrace her steps that day, they learned the bitter truth. Maggie's car was found in the river. It was partially flooded, but empty. Apparently, she was running late, so she went over the speed limit. She must have rammed into the railings of the bridge and fallen into the river. The current is very strong here, so the body could end up even outside the state, said the police officer in charge of the search. No, that's simply impossible. Maggie was always such a great driver, and she would never go over the speed limit. Something's off here, Christopher exclaimed. The police officers looked at each other, but refrained from further comment. The fact was that they found a purse 10 miles down the river. It had Maggie Dawson's documents inside, which served as a direct evidence of her death. Insisting on a large-scale search, Christopher was sure that his wife was alive. Unfortunately, no matter how hard the man tried to prove his case, the facts kept contradicting him. The large-scale search operation found nothing that could give a definitive answer to what had really happened to Maggie Dawson. Even when the search was called off, Christopher continued to look for his wife on his own. He hired private detectives and found some volunteers. Being busy with the search, Christopher didn't even notice when 5 years flew by. All this time, he couldn't even think of anyone else but his missing wife. He dreamed of her every night, and even when he watched movies, he saw his soulmate's face in every actress. During this time, Christopher could have easily gotten remarried, or he could have at least started a new relationship. In this case, Christopher was a one-woman man and simply couldn't betray the memory of his late wife. Thus, the young man intended to remain faithful to her for the rest of his life. If it weren't for his little daughter, Mia, the man would have probably been unable to continue with his life and keep his sanity. After all, it was caring for his daughter that helped Christopher recover from the depression which he fell into after his wife's mysterious disappearance. Of course, 5 years is a long time, and it was definitely enough for the man to learn to endure the pain quietly and even completely disregard it at times. Continuing to believe that Maggie would return one day, Christopher held on to that hope like a lifeline. But days turned into weeks, and there was still no stability in Christopher's life. One day, as he was on his way home from work, the young man decided to stop by a store and get Mia some treats. At this point in their life, the nanny only took care of Mia during the day, while Christopher took over his daughter's care in the evenings. Having parked his car in the parking lot, Christopher quickly walked towards the store. Thinking about what exactly he wanted to get, the man was deep in his thoughts and didn't even immediately notice the beggar woman standing at the counter. Dressed in dirty rags, the woman was checking out something at the counter and counting the change in her hands, probably trying to figure out if she had enough money to pay for what she wanted to get. At that moment, the stranger made an awkward move, and all of the money fell to the floor with a loud sound. If it didn't happen, Christopher would have certainly walked by her. But it did happen, and the man decided to help her pick up the change. He bent down and quickly scooped up the coins. But when he straightened up and looked at the stranger's face, his hand involuntarily unclenched and the change fell back to the floor with the same characteristic sound. "Maggie, is that you?" the man whispered and involuntarily took a couple steps back. The fact was that the woman standing in front of him looked exactly like the missing Maggie Dawson, except that she was clearly very poor and probably homeless. "How did you end up here, and why are you dressed like this?" Christopher whispered. But the stranger shook her head in response and blushed to the very roots of her hair before answering. "I'm sorry, but I don't know you. You must have made a mistake." But it was impossible to convince Christopher. The man recognized the voice and intonation of the woman who was the love of his life. "No, I didn't make a mistake. Here, look, I'll show you our family photos," Christopher exclaimed and reached into his pocket to get his phone. He kept their family photos through all those years, and not a day passed that he didn't look at them. "Here, take a look. That's our wedding. Do you see us? That's me, and that's you. And here's Mia. Do you remember Mia, our daughter?" Christopher asked. Unfortunately, the stranger's face read nothing but sincere confusion. "No, I don't remember any of this. Maybe that isn't me, but some woman who looks a lot like me," the woman suggested. Christopher turned pale, but didn't go back on his words. As if afraid that Maggie would disappear again, the man took her by the hand and quickly led her to the exit. Christopher quickly realized that Maggie had amnesia and that she probably needed medical attention. Having put the woman in the front seat of his car, Christopher started the engine and drove to the nearest hospital. All this time, Maggie looked at the man in surprise, trying to figure out if he was a madman who had just kidnapped her for whatever purpose. "Where are you taking me?" Maggie asked cautiously. "I think you need to see a doctor. I'm sorry, but I think you might have amnesia," Christopher exclaimed impatiently. At that moment, the man wanted his wife to remember everything so badly, so they could finally put all of the misfortunes of the past 5 years behind them. But even after Maggie got examined by the doctor, her problem wasn't an easy one to solve. "You're most likely suffering from temporary amnesia caused by a head injury. Right there, at the top of your head, do you see it? There's a small scar there. I think you got it about 4 or 5 years ago," the doctor said, pointing to a small scar on Maggie's head. Only then did Christopher realize that his wife was most likely attacked by some carjackers 5 years ago. Having picked Maggie up from the clinic, Christopher decided to take her home. When Maggie's relatives learned the good news, their joy knew no bounds. Unfortunately, their happiness was premature. Not only did Maggie not remember any of her relatives, but she clearly felt uncomfortable being back home. Even when she saw her daughter, Mia, the woman didn't recognize her and looked at the child completely alien to her with tears in her eyes. Trying to find a way out of the situation, Christopher hired a hypnosis specialist who held hypnotherapy sessions in order to help Maggie get her memory back. Collecting information by tiny bits and pieces, the hypnosis specialist found out that Maggie had been living with some man named Luke all this time. Saying that her life was hellish would be a huge understatement. The man kept Maggie in some old house like a prisoner and treated her horrifically. At first, Christopher didn't pay much attention to the name of the man that Maggie had been living with. But when Christopher remembered Luke Thompson, the puzzle pieces started coming together in his head. Fortunately, at that moment, Maggie's memory partially returned. The tearful woman confirmed her husband's suspicions. It was Luke Thompson that attacked Maggie 5 years ago, and he stopped his former classmate on the highway and asked for a ride to the nearest exit. In order to cover his tracks, Luke threw the woman's car in the river and drove her purse several miles from the scene, which created the illusion of Maggie Dawson's death. All these 5 long years, Luke did nothing but bully Maggie, who lost her memory, all the while lying to her about being her husband. Tired of his constant nagging, Maggie ran away through the window and started living on the street. Since she didn't have any money or documents, all she could do to earn a living was beg for money. After Maggie gave official testimony to the police, Luke Thompson was detained and taken into custody. The most interesting thing was that at the time of his arrest, it turned out that he was married and had 2 children. All this time, he kept Maggie in a different house, which he'd bought specifically for this purpose. But when the man learned of all the irrefutable evidence against him, he immediately confessed, hoping to get a plea deal. The trial was surprisingly fast, and the jury was unanimous in their decision that Luke Thompson was guilty. Now that he was facing a prison sentence, Maggie and Christopher went back to being a loving family. Meanwhile, I'd like to note that childhood grievances can be so strong that they may seep into adult life and become the cause of terrible and inhumane consequences. In his desire to take revenge on Maggie and Christopher, Luke crossed all boundaries and didn't even realize when he turned into a real criminal. Somewhere down the road, he will probably realize what a terrible mistake he'd made, spending his days in a prison cell feeling lonely and unwanted. Meanwhile, Maggie and Christopher returned to their normal life a month later and directed all of their efforts to make up for the time they had lost.